American Center in Moscow for inviting me to talk to you this evening about many different modes. My name is David Cote, and it's interesting. It's a really good timing that sounds very important, but I often get the question from people like, what actually qualifies you to be a theater critic, besides the fact that you sit at the theater and see a lot of it, and sometimes people pay you to write about it. And I mean, it's a good question, and I sort of broke down my talk with a series of questions that will lead into, we'll also take some actual questions from the chat. So please send your questions on social media, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. So been at this for a long time, 23 years, still going strong, I hope. And but in the last plays, writing texts for music for composers, opera libretti, or song cycles, that sort of thing. And as well as going on residencies to various artist colonies or artist residence in the US, and more recently in places like Ireland and Italy, and which is a great experiences. If there are artists, hopefully go to a pleasant place where you can shake the cobwebs off, shake the dust off, and get some writing done, or if you're a choreographer. What qualifies me to be a theater critic? And I think in general, it's like I think that I have a great enthusiasm for with the theater scene, meaning I'm writing for a reader of a magazine, or audience member, but I'm also in a certain way talking to the artists of the piece as well. The general assumption is that if you're a professional journalist paid to simply show up and write about the thing impartially and objectively, then your audience is your reader. It's the ticket buyer. It's the person who has some knowledge of theater, but perhaps could use more context, more information, and more importantly, are interested in your impressions. My impressions. Why should they care what I think about this new revival of King Lear, or this new musical based on this famous movie, or this thing on Broadway or off Broadway? And it's all I can say is that I have experience, context, enthusiasm, and a sort of, hopefully, a vocabulary in which to describe what I see and translate this massive feelings that you have at a show into interesting prose that's entertaining. I do think that a critic's job is to be not just informative and have his context and provide details. It's also, and that can go any way. Like, what do you mean entertaining? I mean, I mean that the prose is fun to read. It's not laborious. It's not overly academic. It's not overly theoretical. It's for a general reader, and should be entertaining, at least as entertaining as the show, if possible. Through venom, to be blunt about it, by treating the theatrical event as a kind of dartboard for wit, for standards, and withering insults. I'm sort of characterizing it in a sort of maybe a slightly outdated, slightly flamboyant way, but it's. I try to practice a much more measured form of theater criticism, which blends wit and earnestness, and genuine curiosity about new work, and hopefully some authority about revivals of classical plays or golden age musicals, perhaps, or musicals in the past 20 years. So, what is me as a theater critic? Well, all I can say is that I'm a theater background. I studied as an actor and playwright at Bard College many centuries ago. And I came to the city, came to New York, intending to be an actor, I suppose, and maybe a director. And I spent about 8 years in the early to late 90s doing experimental theater downtown, doing work with a Paul Babila, very exotic name, very exotic man. He was a theater maker in Iran in the 60s and 70s, taught at universities and formed his own company and put on shows mostly downtown in New York. I want to stop here and sort of, if you don't know, you may already know, so forgive me if you do. But the ecology of New York theater, which is my background, it's my area of expertise. There's in big cities like LA, Minneapolis, Houston, all over the country, there are large theaters that put on seasons of work. That's the Regional Theater Network. What I'm going to be talking about instead is New York theater. Now, of course, you've heard of Broadway, mostly in the Midtown area of Manhattan. And generally those theaters are 500 to 1,800 or 1,900 seats. A show produced in one of those houses, and depending on the contract that the producers have with the actors. Usually it's commercial work, although there are some nonprofit organizations here in the city who own Broadway theaters and put on Broadway shows. So it's not entirely commercial work that I saw. I'm going to be showing stuff that's actually on real paper because I prize objects. You can see books, but also, we're all sort of living in these screens and boxes, and it's nice to remember that there's physical stuff out there. This is the latest thing I saw, called The Shark is Broken. Play about the making of the movie Jaws, and the three stars of that show, Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw, are dramatized in their downtime between shoots, arguing and getting to know each other. It's a three-man, and I'm still mulling it over, figuring out what to say, writing about. It's on Broadway right now. It's a commercial enterprise. Off-Broadway is in theaters of about under 500 down to about 200 seats, maybe. And off-Broadway theaters in New York are a little freer from the commercial imperatives of Broadway. They are here to put on plays by emerging artists or plays that might this. And those are I don't know the exact count, but there may be 50 or 60 or so of those spaces and companies in New York. And there's some famous ones like the Public Theater, the Roundabout Theater, Lincoln. I find myself Brooklyn Academy of Music in Brooklyn and St. Anne's Warehouse in Brooklyn. All these ones for the past 20-odd years, work by emerging artists, that sort of thing. And that's to me that's the sort of the beating heart of New York theater, which you might have heard of. And off-Broadway generally happens in theaters of 99 seats or fewer. And off-Broadway is not synonymous with experimental, but often, historically, a lot of experimental, off-the-wall, crazy, fourth-wall breaking, challenging work happens in off-Broadway. And I guess I went to this tangent about the strata, if that's right, the strata of New York theater, because I started in the 90s as an off-Broadway actor at places like La Mama, PS. I started in those spaces doing extremely formally challenging work, stuff that was maybe blasphemous, was sometimes confrontational, provocative, was cartoonish and absurdist and surrealist. So I worked those theaters for about 8 years, and then a job opened up at this. This is our next show and tell item. Time Out New York. This magazine, this is called a magazine. They're printed on paper. It's from 2005. It has a cover story about how to fix Broadway, which I contributed to. So Time Out New York in 2000 needed a staff writer. And because I had spent a few years doing self-publishing of a zine called Off, a journal of alternative theater. And Off was self-published on first on Xerox, on paper on a Xerox machine, then on newsprint, very cheap. We distributed them free to theaters, and they contained reviews, articles, manifestos, satirical pieces, listings. And it was my attempt with Jenny Woodward, who is a graphic designer and videographer, and we were friends, and we wanted to put out a publication that represented off-Broadway, which was in the 90s felt like a very vibrant, neglected scene where a lot of young people were pouring into New York City who had either heard about or studied the work of great theater innovators such as Richard Foreman, Robert Wilson, or Anne Bogart, or Meredith Monk. These were names to conjure with. They were people who were still many of them were, all of them were still working, and you could see their work in New York in small spaces, and it was mind-blowing. Really daring people. You will see some of it disturbing and weird and dreamlike, very interesting work, and stuff that people aspired to learn from and maybe imitate in some cases. There's no way of sort of summarizing adequately what it all meant or what it all was constituted. It was not realistic. It was kind of latter-day absurdism. The use of language was heightened, poetic, fragmented. I mean, I suppose, if you theater over the last 100 years, you'll know that something really France. And that continued for 100 years across Europe and in America. And in America, in New York at least, it manifested off Broadway at places like La Mama, that I sort of came up in as an artist. Then in 2000, Time Out New York needed somebody to write about downtown theater and be a critic. So I took the job. I applied, and I guess on the strength of my writing, I got in. It was my first time being a theater critic, and I was terrified because I had lunch with a colleague, and they said, "Well, you should take this job. It's Time Out. It's very, it's kind of prestigious, but prepare to be disliked by total strangers. Prepare to be even hated by total strangers because." Why? And I sort of understood what he meant, because as a theater person, view the critic as the enemy. They're not there to foster the health of the art form. I'm trying to think, like, why is the critic the enemy? I mean, they're there to criticize, which is always associated with negativity. Finding out theater was sort of stronger than my fear of becoming an outsider, becoming an adversary, becoming a disliked person, which, of course, is just sort of a mental game that I was playing. Why do I enjoy it? There's something magical, and I don't know, I hope that some people in the audience have experienced this. There's something really wonderful about translating into, hopefully, good writing. And that could be anything. That could be, of course, visiting a museum, watching a dance, watching a movie. To remember, but I hardly ever refer to it when I write the review, but you probably see critics jotting in their notebooks because you're just trying to sort of get down in the notebook that what just happened. I can't rewind it. I can't go back and reread that chapter. I can't stop the movie and go back to start at the beginning. You experience something in time, and you need to sort of translate that into however many words. And so it's really a pleasure to do that, because when you feel like you've actually communicated what you felt after a few days of mulling it over and then writing it, the matter is, the ugly truth about, I think, being a critic in any field is that the very brilliant stuff and the very bad stuff are fairly rare. The majority of what you see is sort of about it. You can call it mediocre if you want, but what does that mean? Mediocre. It's neither here nor there. It's so-so. So there's a quote by Stanley Kaufman, who's this great, late great theater critic who wrote for good or bad, but the criticism must always be good. And that's really can be a challenge if you're cranking out 3 reviews a week for month after month. It's like you can't let the mediocre quality of a show drag down the writing, because nobody wants to read a review that says, I didn't really care, I was sort of bored. You have to care, you have to be engaged, you have to wrestle with yourself about why you needed. The golden rule, I mean, there are no rules about criticism, there's no rules about or exactly. But there's sort of the 3 golden rules that I always return to, and I forget who exactly said them, articulated for the critic to sort of, there's many a time when I've interviewed a playwright or a director, and I've said, this part in this play meant this, and then in the course of the review, evaluating how well they achieved it. Consideration would be a sort of broader cultural assessment of was it worth attempting in the first place. And I guess one big interesting, I want to say as well that Kenneth Tynan, the British theater critic in the 50s and 60s and 70s, had a great quote where but a really great critic can identify what's not happening. And I think that's very important too, to have a very broad view of the scene. And that comes out of seeing a lot of theater. And who can only review a certain type of work is really not very useful, because they can only review Broadway musicals because they are obsessed with Broadway musicals. They love Broadway musicals. When they sit in front of a sort of non-realistic, neo-absurdist family tragedy with stuffed animals appearing on stage and garbage raining down from the heavens and crashing into the living, when they see something that's crazy wild, they will not know what they're looking at. Similarly, an art critic who only writes about 19th century landscape, if they art, I don't know if it is a very, very, very minor. They are creating a piece of writing which might be entertaining, but is a minor piece of writing. It's not in itself a work of art. There's this wonderful term for, oh gosh, I should know this. The W.H. Auden poem, Musée des Beaux-Arts, which is a beautiful poem about Bruegel's The Fall of Icarus. And there's a type of poem or that type of art. It's called ekphrastic, like ekphrastic poetry. That's EKPHRASTIC. I could be wrong about that. But ekphrastic poetry or ekphrastic writing, could be ekphrastic music, is something which is art that's taken from art. So criticism is not ekphrastic, unless you want to practice a form of criticism which is completely abiding by no rules of regular criticism. But there's an ekphrastic element to criticism, I suppose. Anyway, it's interpretive. I'm sort of all over the place, I'm sorry, but these are ideas that have always obsessed me for Libretti writing. That this sounds really, and it's not, okay, absolutely black and white, or what's the word I'm looking for? It's I guess anyway, it's very binary, I suppose. Generative, an artist is either generative or interpretive. And now that I've said that, you should statement perhaps, but I do believe it, because to being a generative artist, meaning, and I guess I would put it into that category, a writer, a playwright. It's out of previous culture, it's out of their lives, but they've created something that people can, if you've written a play, then people can stage that play. They can design a set to go for that play. They can direct that play. Is the director and the actor generative or interpretive? If they couldn't do anything without that generative act, then they must be interpretive. The critic is a super interpretive, peripheral, parasitic worker on the margins of art. Doesn't mean they can't be influential or articulate or even identify a trend in the theater that lasts for decades. It's possible, but some artists, I think becoming a critic was also a bit of a blow to my sense of myself as somebody who created art. Of course, being an actor, I could also say, well, as an actor, you weren't creating art. You were simply slotting yourself into another person's artistic vision. So, anyway, I worked here for about 8 years. No, what am I saying? Well, no, I worked here for actually 17 years. I was an actor for about 8 years. Started at Time Out. First as a staff theater critic, and then after about 3 years, I became the theater editor. So I got to assign freelancers to different shows. I got to assign shows to myself, edit the section. And I want to say also, having a relationship with a media company, a blog, website, or social media posts. But if you work with an editor, you're very lucky. It's key to creating a quote-unquote professional piece of writing. And like you may be trying to pursue some idea in the review, and the editor is there to read that first draft, and to help you hone your vision. They're there to show to sort of, when you seem to be getting off track, to get you back on track. When you're being too vague, they're there to sort of help you to get more specific. Use a specific example from the play. If you talk about how the dialogue is rapid fire and neo screwball or something, why don't you give us a little example of that? So the editor is that writing the best piece possible to help you make that argument as strong as possible. So, and to me, having the combination of responsibility to get my facts right and to really consider the piece of work before me, the parts of calling myself a professional theater critic. Now, 23 years after I started, the landscape of being a professional theater critic has changed quite a bit. It's a lot harder, fewer jobs out there. For the magazine American Theater in like 2007 or so, I did a survey of 12 theater critics across America who were supposedly influential. And then about 5 or so years after that, and they were theater critics in LA, Minneapolis, Chicago, major cities in Florida. And yeah, about 5 or so were taking buyouts, retired, that sort of thing. Over the past 20 years, there's been a great dwindling in the profession of theater critic because arts desks at magazines and newspapers around shrinking. There's less and less interest in covering the art. I suppose it's very complicated, and I should be able to discuss it. I think, at least when I was in my last years at Time Out, I think it had a lot of traffic, online traffic in a magazine at the website. And theater is a very local activity. You have to be there to see it. There's here and there's more increasing broadcast of theater channels you can subscribe to and see opera productions from around the world. But yes, I think that the arts are under attack, both in the media and in the real world. We can get to that. But so anyway, there are fewer jobs than ever, and fewer outlets covering theater, covering classical music, covering dance. And this is terrible. This is terrible. In my opinion, there should be for arts coverage in America, a nonprofit organization, well-funded, that pays critics to go out and review things. And it's not out there who wants to gobble up information about theater reviews or whatever. Because in the end, we live in a culture that prizes video games and blockbuster superhero movies. Seen recent stories in the New York Times or American Theater or Washington Post and elsewhere, but for the last year or so, there's been a lot of alarm in the theater world because theater companies like LA Theater, Brooklyn Academy of Music, and other spaces have been cutting back on staff and programming. So it's not it's a sort of post-pandemic thing. I guess you could say that the factors involved are audience shrinkage after the audiences that were normally coming to the theater, watching TV, avoiding the chance of getting reinfected with COVID, that sort of thing. There's also the factor towards social justice causes and inflation. Due to the rapid inflation we've been experiencing for the past 2 years, productions cost more. So those three factors seem to be squeezing a lot of theaters. And in terms of how they affect my job, well, I review what I can review. I can't review everything that's out there, so I'll review 3 or 4 shows a month. But it does, I guess, sort of create the consideration, should I be supportive of the shows I see rather than critical? Is my job to help sort of the strength of the field rather than analyze this play or musical? And I would say no, I can't. That can't be my job. I mean, I know some of my fellow critics have been writing stories about the crisis and calling it is, in some cases, the best thing we can do. I mean, I guess it as well. So I suppose writing an option step in and subsidize theaters. Otherwise, American theater's in peril. Another piece in the Washington Post I saw recently by the playwright Monica Byrne was saying we need to pivot away from artistic directors' salaries and move the money to artists. We need to support artists. This needs to be an artist-centric economy or ecology for theater, not worrying about building a... No, those are very strong arguments. It's a very tough time in America right now in terms of sustainability in the arts and sustainability in my field. So that's all. Everything's related. I'm like looking at my notes here. Generative versus interpretive. That's a bit crackpot. That might be crackpot. I don't know. Let's see. So, okay, well, since I found myself in the 2000s I was at the end of the party, I decided that my plan B, I was going to become an opera librettist. Now that's a sustainable career. Can you detect my heaven? What can I say? I began as an artist, as an actor, and a little bit of a director. In 2008, I don't know, I think I just really wanted to become a generative artist. I wanted to write things. They say that, the cliche about a critic being a frustrated artist, in some ways was true, but then again, what artist isn't frustrated? I had a friend who was a composer, went to Bard College with him, and I was new opera at the time, which in the last 20 years in America, new opera had I would say a boom in the sense that a lot of new work is being found, productions at opera houses, especially today is another question. But there's a lot of new American opera being produced. Sometimes when I tell people I do opera, I write for opera. First they think can't write music at all. But then they're like, in English? And I'm like, yeah, there's actually a long tradition of opera in English. Henry Purcell in the 1600s in England, up to present day, Philip Glass, and at the Met recently, Terence Blanchard and Matthew O'Coin, and there are lots of great living American composers and librettists. Anyway, so I started getting interested in that field, partially because I also wanted to be a playwright. And I think consciously on some level I thought writing an opera, a play with training wheels, because the music will have to support the text. And there's also the fact that I love musical theater. I mean, not all. There was a recent show called Back to the Future, the musical, based on Back to the Future, the movie. And look up my review if you want. But Broadway musicals are, when they get it right, when they're artful and clever. I'm not going to go into what it is to write a libretto. I will say that a libretto is not a qualities. That is usually very concise and very terse, and must inspire the composer. And if it's character driven, this is actually from 20. Now this opera, this opera premiered in 2019 at Cincinnati Opera. And here's the booklet. See, there's a little libretto in here. Yeah, I guess I could just... Let me just show you. Yeah, here we go. As you can see, it looks a little like a play. Anyway, most recent opera that I premiered. So between 2008 and 2019, I was sort of getting more and more involved in the world of opera. And in years as a critic, as well as being a person from the theater, to me to be a writer, or allowed me to start something and finish it. Anyway, just checking the time here. Oh my gosh. So this is very exciting. Something came out last fall. This is my last show and tell item. Moulin Rouge, the musical. The story of the Broadway spectacular. Now, this, about the Broadway musical Moulin Rouge, based on the Baz Luhrmann 2001 movie Moulin Rouge. And I worked on this during the pandemic, and it was exciting. Here's a part about the can-can. A lot of can-can. That's an interesting job for a critic, because usually the critic's job there's a sort of packed on press night, and you write about what you saw. You don't know who made the decisions in the rehearsal room, and you just sort of write about it as intelligently as you can. This job was spending like a year and a half or so interviewing everybody associated with the production and getting to know what happened in the rehearsal room, what was changed, what was kept, what was discovered. A show is put together. And I'll just end by saying, I think that every critic in whatever field should also have a creative side to what they do, because the two things enrich each other. If you can turn on your artist brain, and then vice versa, turn off your artist brain and turn on your critic brain when you're working, I think you can have a very harmonious conversation between the lobes of your brain. Okay. Question number 1. Okay. David, when did you first realize you could juggle the roles of both a critic and artist, and did one precede the other? Okay, I don't know if I answered that, but he's a critic and artist. Well, I mean, in some ways, it took me 8 years, because I got the job at Time Out in about 2000. Because you want to get the play produced, so do you show them? Who do you show them to? Who do you mail them to? And this is where, of course, you have to avoid conflicts of interest. If anybody finds themselves in the similar situation, I don't take my plays weird. I have relationships with directors and with some artistic directors, but my best bet would be to try to get a play produced outside of New York, or self-produce. Next year I may self-produce a one-person play that I wrote. The main thing is to avoid conflicts of interest, and to know you're all doing it for love of theater. Let's see. Number 2, you've written for various renowned publications. Can you share an article or piece that personally resonated with you the most, and why? Resonated the most. Known publications. I guess, okay, there's an article I wrote in 2006 that was it was a review of a play called Rabbit Hole, which was a play by a very gifted, excellent playwright named David Cote, produced by Manhattan Theater Club. And it was a play about a grieving family who had lost a very young son to a senseless car accident. A mother consumed with grief, perfectly competent play, but its presence in the theater landscape was really depressing, because it felt like a TV movie. It felt like a really bourgeois, boring living room drama. I didn't swear in the review, and I won't swear here, but I was just saying, like, why aren't we stifling realist dramas? So that got a lot of attention, and I meant it. At the same time, and David Cote did not hurt his career at all. He's gone on Kimbo. And he wrote a play a few years later called Good People, which was about class in America, just checking the time, which was an excellent Good People. David Cote, excellent playwright. I even bowed down to his feet. Awards sold. I groveled at his feet. It was very funny. Anyway, that was I meant that when I wrote it. But a critic revolution. If every week you're calling for theater revolution. Okay. Question 3. What has been the most impactful piece of theater or opera you've witnessed, and how did it shape your career? Oh boy. Well, I guess this is sort of since you people don't. In 2000, there was a play called The Designated Mourner by Wallace Shawn. It had been produced at the National Theatre in London a few years earlier. And I read the play, because I bought the published play in a bookstore, and then the play came in 2000. It was performed in an abandoned men's club in the Wall Street area, like sort of a club for wealthy smoke cigars in, but it was abandoned, and they put on this show. Anyway, the play is an amazing play about the a protagonist who sort of explains his complete betrayal of his lover or his wife in his a time when his country sort of descends into totalitarian, anti-intellectual, funny and horrible and a little obscene and clear-eyed about America in the 21st century, written just before the 21st century. Wallace Shawn, The Designated Mourner. It was site-specific, directed by Giant. Wallace Shawn, one of America's greatest playwrights. And it just chilled me to the bone. It thrilled me. It was dark and scary, and I've been trying to ever since. And it also was like, it had a character who was dense and complicated and a bit loathsome, but very dynamic. I mean, characters in conflict are always interesting to me. Characters in conflict, doing the wrong thing. Also, like, I'm bored of plays where people are nice to each other. Question 4, are there certain rituals or practices you maintain to keep your creative juices flowing? Going to artist colonies is great, artist residencies. Rituals, sacrificing rabbits, sacrificing, no. I mean, no, sorry, no rituals. I just, one feeds the other. Practices. I wish I had practices. How has feedback, both positive and critical, shaped your endeavors? Well, I mean, gave it a very shallow, dismissive review. I'll feel like you didn't really. So, I mean, I experienced the same sort of frustration and anger that any artist would, if they read a review that they felt didn't get the piece. And and I've had artists tell me, "Oh, I read your review and you really got it." And that's very nice, but it's also meaningless because I don't know what that means. I really got it because there's no absolutely correct response to a play or work of art of any kind. It's like that old saying, like, if you believe when they love you, you have to believe them when they hate you or dislike you. But in terms of growth, to me, the growth happens when you're working on a piece of a play or the growth happens with collaborators. I'm as an artist, as a creative artist, I'm not really at the level right now to. I have colleagues who are brilliant and a lot smarter than me and a lot more probably insightful than I am. And it could be that they have written reviews that have helped other artists. Your collaborator. Question 6, do you believe there's a responsibility for artists and critics alike to address societal issues in their work? Why or why not? Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's societal in the sense of wars or economic inequality or issues of sexual harassment, things that are in the world and aren't going away, but people are talking perhaps. I mean, obviously you have to address those things. Then there's also societal in the sense of theater culture, like how the state of theater as a cultural entity. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some critics who like bring the headlines into their roots, like okay, yeah, this is really dumb and trivial, but like somewhere in New York, I don't know if it was Long Island or in Far Rockaway, was a woman who was attacked by a shark. This is a dumb example. But it's like you can like sort of bring the world, or if there's a play about sexual harassment, or this also brings up an issue of like what are the responsibilities and limitations of a straight white male theater critic, which is what I happen to be. And I don't even have an answer to this either, but like, do I have any right to review a play written by a person of color? Informed people might say about the play, and I don't have an answer to that. It's a very difficult question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if I believe theater that is important to the world, then I should talk about how it's in conversation with the world. Or if I feel like it's not in conversation with the world, I can bring that up. But yeah, I don't think there's any. Yes, we have to talk about what's happening in the world. Advice. So for me to say, well, you're not going to get a job as a theater critic that's sustainable, so you have to do it on your own. I mean, again, I guess find a collapse. Even if you have no interest in being a an artist, find a collaborator as a critic, as a writer, somebody who loves theater as much as you do, maybe who goes to see a show with you, but someone who can respond to your writing and help you with it, maybe. If you're, say, self-publishing reflections on the work that you see. I would say another piece of advice, don't read other critics. Job at Time Out. I went immediate evocative, was trying to, he reviewed Look Back in Anger, the play by John Osborne in 1956, which was a very gritty, sort of like angry working class play. I mean, it was very working class, but also with a character, Jimmy Porter, who was extremely articulate and waspish. Tynan said something like, I could love anyone who didn't want to see Look Back in Anger. Meaning, you need to see this work. It is your moral responsibility as or you're not my friend. So Tynan was, and he was funny and he was witty. So as a critic, I would say, try to have it all. Try to be witty, be funny, be earnest. You can do it. Because ultimately all you're doing is saying, you can't make everything conform to your taste, nor should you. But you are coming at things from a very subjective place. And don't hide that. You should be the friendly voice for your reader that encourages them to go see something. Or if they're going to go see something anyway, but they're curious about what's happening there. As far as being an artist goes, I would say, this is a very glib thing that I've been saying, and I need plenty to jump off soon, thing I've been saying about plays, but it's great if you're political and you want to point out the injustices of the world. But I don't think that it's necessarily very interesting to see plays in which people tell us what good people they are, or how they are, really supporting strong moral positions on social issues. I mean, I think write a play from the innermost part of yourself that you would be ashamed to show your parents. Which is the worst part of you, the darkest part of you, the most bratia karamatrovai, forgive my pronunciation. And I've always, Dostoevsky, I'm a Dostoevskian first and a Tolstoyan second. Yeah, so I would say share your fear, share your darkness, and share your love and your light as well. But humans are complex, messy. Let humans be messy. And so anyway, that's it. Thank you for watching, and thank you to the, sorry, confuser. Yes, thank you to the American Center.